His birthday is about to come up, which he would be 30, and it's hard. And he ain't gonna never walk through the door. It's like living it all over again.
The force of impact caused massive internal hemorrhaging and destroyed his organs from the inside.
Actions taken sometimes end up being a cycle. I do something to you, now you're gonna do something to me.
I believe that she put all the anger from every fight that her son ever had in his life, or every time he got beat up, into one person.
The cost of revenge in this case, I think, is beyond reckoning.
November 8th, 2009. At 4 p.m., police in Elgin, Illinois, received multiple emergency calls from an apartment complex.
Our shift had just started, and the first of a series of 911 calls came in related to a hit and run involving a child. At least initially, that's how it was described.
Callers were frantically seeking help for a teenage boy who had been struck by a vehicle in the parking lot. Dispatchers can hear the chaos and commotion going on, and they immediately send emergency vehicles to the scene.
When they arrive, they find a young man lying on the ground, covered in blood.
There was at least 10 people, if not more, around the victim, screaming, yelling, trying to talk to the officers. And as the officers got there, they had to try to make sense of what happened, who did this, and get as much of this information out as fast as possible while also rendering any kind of first aid and help to the victim.
Residents identified the victim as 17-year-old John Keys, who lives in the building with his mother.
Paramedics realized that Keys' injuries are extremely severe, and he is rushed to Sherman Hospital.
Massive amount of damages to the inside of his body, to his organs, to his spine, to his pelvis area.
The severity of the impact becomes immediately clear. There's tire marks that are leading toward the point of impact. There's pieces of the car, there's headlight assemblies, bumper parts laying everywhere, and a large electrical box had been moved 5 inches off of its mooring.
Considering that the damage that was done on the building and the serious injuries suffered by the victim, you're talking a car maybe going 20, 30 miles an hour.
It's pretty obvious that Keys was struck with a tremendous amount of force.
John W. Keys III, known as Little John, was born in Chicago, Illinois on July 8, 1992. The youngest of 5 children raised by Dion Harris and John Keys Jr.
I was overwhelmed, joy, real excited, because he was my first boy, and I wanted a boy for many, many years.
We wound up with 4 girls, but at that point, we were both saying, hey, this is enough, okay? I love my kids, but we had to slow down. But when I got Lil John, it was just everything to me.
From the beginning, Little John was outgoing and eager to keep up with his older siblings.
My very first memory of us is when we were younger. I was about 5 or 6. John was probably 10, 11 months at the time, and we were playing hide and go seek, and I tried to hide from the seeker, and I jumped on John, and I broke his leg. So he was crawling around with the cast on his first birthday.
He used to drag that leg and go everywhere he needed to go, stairs and all. It did not stop him. Always running, always smiling. That's just how he was. He was my boy. I just let him have his way. Whatever he wanted to do, whatever he wanted to go, he always got to do that.
I'm gonna say that he was spoiled. He got more. So he had his own room and his own space and his own toys.
Little John's parents had been high school sweethearts, but after 16 years together, they'd begun to grow apart.
We was happy for a long time, but John's was out in the street a lot, so I wasn't happy with that.
I was a lot better father than I was husband, unfortunately. Between the womanizing and the running the street and stuff like that, she just pretty much got tired of it.
They eventually separated, and Dion took the children to live in nearby Elgin, Illinois. She officially filed for divorce in 2000.
I think Lil John was around 8 or 9 when she and I split up. Kind of hit him hard.
I felt like he was a little bit more hurt because he was the only boy and my dad was the only other man in the house. So when he left, he was like, I'm the man of the house. He didn't want to be like our little brother anymore. He just wants to be himself.
For Little John, being himself meant following in his father's footsteps.
He was always with me every other weekend. We had our classes here and there, but that was my best friend in the world. Me and Lil John was 2 peas in a pod.
When he started getting like to 7th grade, he started getting interested in young ladies. But I used to tell him that comes with a job. You're not old enough right now. I told him how you have a girlfriend and you can't buy nothing or do anything for her. And he like, well, I'm gonna get a job and I'm gonna help you around the house. You can pay me to get something, to get a gift.
He was a hustler. He knew how to get money. We rake lawns and shovel snow and things like that. He's a hustler, he's getting money, and he's doing it the right way.
By the time he was 17, Little John had more girlfriends than he knew what to do with.
A lot of girls liked him, you know, because he was a handsome dude.
He transformed himself into this guy that had money, and he had the persona, he had the clothes, the look, and so he said, no, I'm not Little John, I'm King Cash. I believe that the attention that my brother started to receive at such a young age definitely blew up his ego to the point where he's like, oh, well, all these girls like me? Well, I'm gonna make sure my hair's always cut and my clothes are always clean, shoes are always clean, and I'm gonna look good, and I'll get even more women.
But for Little John, more women meant trouble.
With the girls that like him, it's always a jealous boyfriend or a jealous ex, and he wasn't the type to back down. Even if he just had met the girl, he'd be like, she over here with me now.
Sometimes the other guys made it physical.
He would just beat him up, and he got suspended for it. I was like, well, he know how to fight. That's one thing his dad taught him how to fight.
He was just like me. He didn't go around, he didn't start fights, but he didn't back down an inch. You know, if you brought it to him, he's gonna meet the challenge.
The constant fighting eventually got him expelled.
After you get into a certain amount of trouble at the regular schools, they'll send you to an alternative school. And so they sent my brother to Central because of the behavioral. They try to say he had behavioral issues.
He only went maybe 2 weeks, and they called me from there. The principal was like, he don't need to be here. Do I have the money to take him to get the GED? Because he's too advanced to be here. He don't need what we teach him.
In late October 2009, Little John began making plans to move to Indianapolis to be with his father and get his GED.
He called me and told me, Dad, I'm ready to come back down here. And we sat there on the phone and we made a plan about what was going to be done when he got back down there. You know, you continue to get your GED. I'm going to help you find a job, and you're going to, you know, things going to get better. He knew I was going to be his support group.
He definitely had dreams of going to college and getting some form of business degree, and he wanted to be a businessman.
Just 2 weeks later, those plans would be shattered. Now, Little John is clinging to life after being struck by a car, and police want to know why.
The witnesses are in shock, and the police officers have to try to gather more information so that we can find out who did this.
callers didn't really know if this was intentional or accidental at the time. There's an immense pressure on them to find a person who did it.
As EMTs rush 17-year-old hit-and-run victim Little John Keys to the hospital, police in Elgin, Illinois begin piecing together what happened.
When they examined the impact scene, there was blood on the outside wall to include paint transfer from the vehicle at the point of impact. They also found tire tracks in the direction of the impact to show from the direction that the person was driving towards the victim.
One of the witnesses is a 17-year-old girl who tells investigators she watched the tragedy unfold from her apartment.
It was unseasonably warm and the window was open at the time. The girl saw John Keys, also known as Little John, down in the parking lot.
She said that she had called out to him, he didn't hear her, but she continued to look out the window, and at that time she had observed a blue vehicle entering the area, and the vehicle proceeds right at Little John.
The blue car proceeds to jump a curb, hits Keys from behind, and sends him flying face and chest first into this electrical box and into the side of the apartment building.
And according to the witness, it quickly became clear it wasn't an accident.
The girl says the blue car backs up, and as Keys crumples to the ground, another green vehicle pulls up. She sees a woman get out of the blue car, but instead of going to check on Keys to make sure he's okay, she says, "Y'all mess him up," or something to that effect. At this point, men get out of the green vehicle, one of them carrying a baseball bat. The girl says one of the men went up to Keys, struck him on the head, and said, "Talk trash now."
The witness says when it was over, the assailants fled. At that point, she called 911.
A lot of times when someone witnesses a traumatic event, it's such thing that really shakes them. They can recall some details, but when you think about how this emotionally impacted the 17-year-old, I mean, here she is, she sees a friend of hers who is, at this point, she believes, severely injured.
Word of the tragic assault travels fast.
Lil John's girlfriend called me. She called and said, Lil John been hit by a car. And I'm like, what? And I was like, okay, I'm on my way. I beat them to Sherman Hospital. When I got there, they was pulling Lil John out of the ambulance.
Within moments, her worst fears are confirmed.
I knew there wasn't no life in him. My mind went blank. I couldn't think. I only thought of one phone number. My friend Darlene, I called her phone and told her, Lil John gone. And she said, gone where? I said, he's gone. He passed away.
So I was literally in traffic when I got the call that my brother was murdered, and I could not move. I physically was stuck in Chicago traffic, and there was nothing that I could do but scream, scream, yell, cry. And my aunt's right there, and I could tell she was trying to be like strong, but she was crying too.
Little John's family gathers at the hospital.
Seeing my brother laid there with just one drop of blood, he still had a smile on his face. So I don't know if he was running and laughing at the same time, but I could never get his face out of my head. Me and his girlfriend went in there and we both gave him a kiss on the forehead. And that was that.
Authorities are now investigating a homicide. and Little John's friends think they know one of the people responsible.
Detectives continued their neighborhood canvass, and they were able to determine that LaCorbic Binion did, in fact, hit John Keys with the baseball bat. Another witness recognizes the young man with the baseball bat.
Just a few hours after Little John Keys was run over and beaten to death, a witness thinks she can identify one of the suspects involved. 16-year-old LaCorbic Binion.
LaCorbic Binion is another student at Larkin. We went to school together. Prior to everything that happened with my brother, he was okay. He was cool. We would speak in the hallways. He wasn't as outgoing as my brother, who would go talk to anybody and try to get any girl. I do not believe that they knew each other. Never hung out, didn't run in the same crowd.
According to the witness, Little John and LaCorbic crossed paths at the same party the night before. It didn't go well.
The story that I got from my brother, Lil John's girlfriend, was that my brother was dancing with a girl, and the girl was LaCorbic's girlfriend. And LaCorbic did not like that, and so he pushed my brother. My brother reacted and hit him in the face.
When my son called his balance, he walked up to him and hit him across the eye, and his eye started bleeding. And he was like, "Your girl asked to dance with me, what you pushing me for?" But when my son seen the blood, they said he took off running because there was so much blood, it scared him.
He wasn't trying to beat him or hurt him too bad. He pushed him, he hit him once, and that was that.
When investigators speak to Little John's family, they confirm the story. They say at the time, it didn't seem like anything to be concerned about.
11 or 12 at night, he was like, "Sis, they kicked me out the party." And I was like, "For what?" And he was like, "Cause I was dancing with this dude's girlfriend and he pushed me, so I hit him." And I was like, "You okay?" And he was just like, "Yeah, I'm good." He didn't seem like, "Oh, I just got into a world of mess" or anything like that. It was just basically a altercation between two teenage boys.
I just heard that he was at the party and the girl was dancing on him. The next day, he's dead.
If LaCorbic was the one with the bat, police need to find him, the others in the green car with him, and the driver of the blue car that hit Little John. Soon, Sergeant Trost's keen eye gives them their next good lead.
I was sitting at the Price Right liquor store gas station, and as I'm sitting there watching traffic going westbound, I heard this thump, 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 which sounded to me like a flat tire, and I see this older vehicle pulls right into the gas station.
The car is a blue 1991 Chrysler Imperial, and the damage to its front end immediately makes Sergeant Trost suspicious.
And I observed 3 people standing at the driver's side door of this vehicle. An older female, a younger female, and then a male juvenile. All 3 of them, I knew right away they had been through some sort of trauma at that point. I just didn't know exactly what it was. Now they start walking away. Instead of going into the gas station or even approaching me if they had a problem, they start walking away from me. And I exit my vehicle and I get out and I say that, "Hey, we just had a report of an accident up the street and I'd like to, talk to you." The other younger woman, probably about 19 or so, appeared to have some kind of injuries, some facial injuries. So I requested an ambulance.
While they await the paramedics, Trost spots a harrowing detail on the car.
It appeared to have some kind of damage to it, and there was no way you could not mistake the amount of blood that was on that vehicle.
And suddenly, a shocking confession.
Tamara Branch, the older female, who was the driver of the vehicle, says, "I hit that boy."
According to witnesses, 2 vehicles were involved in the hit-and-run murder of little John Keys. The blue car that ran him over, and a green car carrying 16-year-old LaCorbic Binion, the boy who allegedly beat him. Police are still looking for LaCorbic. But after a traffic stop, the driver of the blue car has made a spontaneous confession.
With her comment to me, now I know that this changes more from just an initial stop to an actual criminal investigation that, can be quite serious. Because if I were to continue questioning her, I would have to ensure that I Mirandized her. So at this point, I didn't ask any questions of her. And I requested for an additional unit.
Wherever there's a murder investigation in Illinois, you have to have a videotaped interrogation of the murder suspect. It has to be videotaped. So, they needed to bring her back to the station to get her on tape, basically.
That doesn't stop the suspect from talking, however. She identifies herself as 33-year-old Tamara Branch.
She had overheard the radio content of having a show-up witnesses come see the vehicle, etc. And she made a statement to the effect of, there's no reason for that, and again stated, I hit that boy, and we'll let the judge sort it out.
Detectives looked into her background and history, and they didn't find that much. She was a mother of 3, lived in nearby Streamwood, and worked at a large department store. The only thing she had on her record were minor traffic offenses.
There was no violence in her background. It's what makes the investigation even more difficult, trying to understand why someone's going to do something like this.
Still not in the recorded interrogation, she offers a direct explanation.
She readily admitted that she ran down little John because her son, LaCorbic Binion, had been bullied by him.
Tamara told police officers that she believed that her son, LaCorbic, had been picked on and bullied at school. I think that she went after John Keys in an effort to pay him back for what he had done to her son, LaCorbic, the night before. And she was going to teach LaCorbic a lesson and how to stand up for himself.
And she even asked at one point, "What would you do?"
But as questioning heats up, she delivers a wildly abrupt change to her story.
After police began asking her questions about her front end damage, she claimed that it was from a previous incident. Police also questioned her about whether or not she knew John Keys, but she said she didn't. She also said that she was just in the area meeting somebody and had no idea where the blood came from on her front bumper.
In essence, she denied absolutely everything in the taped interview. She denied the incident between her son and little John that had occurred the night before also.
Watching the video of her in Elgin police custody, you could look at her and tell that she was making up stories. Oh, my car had already had an accident and, it just stopped right there. So I was just going to walk and leave it and go get somebody to help me come back and get it. She lied continuously, didn't drop a tear, no remorse, no nothing.
She probably realized how serious it was and began to try to minimize her role in the entire situation, just as a defense mechanism. But the physical evidence, the witnesses, everything was there.
Police arrest Tamara and charge her with first-degree murder. But without her confession, they'll need more to prove she did it.
Police at this point are just trying to shore up their evidence. But there's, plenty of other eyewitnesses and physical evidence, that's readily available.
Tamara's son, LaCorbic, is still nowhere to be found. The next day, on November 8th, investigators track down his girlfriend to see what she can tell them. When they get to the girl's house, they're met by her father instead. He assures them she had nothing to do with little John's death. And the reason he knows is because he was in the green car.
So at this party the night before, where John Keys had struck LaCorbic, LeCorbic's girlfriend was there. LeCorbic's girlfriend's parents got there, and the father ended up taking LeCorbic to the hospital.
On the way to the hospital, he overheard a conversation between LeCorbic and Tamara.
Tamara expressed frustration and anger. She stated that her son had been subject to continued bullying, and she felt that the time was now that he needed to stand up for himself against this.
Tamara told LeCorbic, I'm sick of you being a little B-word, and I'm going to teach you how to go in on somebody.
The investigation into the murder of little John Keyes is only a few hours old, and police already have a suspect in custody, 33-year-old Tamara Branch. Now they're getting a clearer picture of what happened from one of the men who were there.
The father of Tamara's son's girlfriend stated Tamara was emotional, was upset, related to the fact that her son was being bullied and that this incident had occurred the night before where her son got injured by Little John.
So Sunday, she woke her son up to come and fight my child. She told her son, you ain't gonna be no punk. You gonna fight him today. You ain't gonna keep letting people bully you. The son didn't want to fight, but she forced him.
The father says he agreed to take LeCorbic to confront little John. 2 other boys came with them.
He stated Tamara found information about where Little John was, and that he agreed to go along to keep things from, in his words, from getting out of hand.
The man says he followed Tamara to Little John's apartment building, but when they got there, she decided to take matters into her own hands.
I don't think that Tamara probably planned to hit him with the car, to crush him with the car, until she saw him in that instant, decided that she was going to use her car as a weapon against John.
She had it in her head that her son was no longer going to take this, and she was going to be the person to show him, this is how you get revenge.
This is how she went to get payback for a teenage fistfight. This is how you respond.
But Tamara still wasn't satisfied. With little John unconscious and bleeding on the ground, she ordered her son to finish the job.
Tamara's son exits the vehicle with the baseball bat, and at the direction of Tamara, proceeds to strike Little John, who was clearly severely injured, with the baseball bat several times.
To hear that he got out afterwards to try to hit my brother's body at that point, I was furious. Because I knew this kid, and it's like, you don't have the balls yourself, and you thought that that was the moment that you needed to get back at him when he was already hit by a car and possibly dead.
After the incident, they immediately re-entered their vehicles and exited from the scene as fast as they could.
An autopsy confirms investigators' suspicions. Little John could not have survived his injuries from the crash, no matter what happened afterwards.
The King County coroner did their investigation related to this, and the findings included the fact that he had severe damage to his pelvic area, broken bones, and a severed major artery, which caused massive bleeding, which all proved to be fatal.
Regardless of what LeCorbic had done with the baseball bat at the scene, John Keyes was, for all intents and purposes, dead at the scene. He was not going to make it. So there was absolutely nothing that LeCorbic did that would have changed, that would have made it worse.
Investigators are also able to obtain surveillance footage that shows the two vehicles leaving the scene.
Tamara got back in her car, backed it up, drove out of the parking lot, and drove down the street about a block to this gas station convenience store, all the while leaving a trail of automobile fluid, oil, antifreeze, that sort of thing along the road. You can see the damage to the front of the car. You can see the damage to the tire and wheel well.
Armed with this new witness statement and the evidence collected at the crime scene, prosecutors believe they have a strong enough case to go to trial.
Given the information that's available, it's very reasonable to conclude that Tamara had sought out where little John was, created a plan and how to deal with him, and set it into motion, which is, a cold and calculating conspiracy that she created here to go after this young boy.
4 months later, on March 23, 2010, a grand jury decides to indict LeCorbic Binion for first-degree murder.
LeCorbic had gone with some family members down to Arkansas and was no longer in the Elgin area by the time we got around to charging him.
He's arrested without incident in Arkansas and taken back to Illinois to face trial.
There were witnesses who said that he got out of the car and he had a bat. There were witnesses who said he then took a couple of swings at Jonathan. You can't just be out doing vigilanteism. Should LeCorbic have been struck the night before? No. But there's ways that needs to be handled by the police, by the judicial system. You don't do payback on your own.
Authorities in Elgin, Illinois, have charged 2 people for the murder of little John Keys, 16-year-old LeCorbic Binion and his mother, Tamara Branch. Witnesses say it was a coordinated act of revenge for a fist fight between the 2 boys.
They said that the boy pushed him, and that's why he punched him. They like, yeah, LeCorbic had to go to the hospital, so that's why his mom came and ran him over. And I'm like confused, like, okay, your son got into a fight and you come and run down a kid? Are you okay? Like, I couldn't wrap my head around that.
In August 2011, Tamara's trial finally begins.
In Illinois, you don't even need an intent to kill. If you just have an intent to cause them great bodily harm and what you do to them causes the death, you can be guilty of first-degree murder.
The witnesses in the other car with LeCorbic aren't charged with anything, but one of the passengers testifies to Tamara's state of mind.
He had overheard how Tamara was explaining how upset she was and how she was, in essence, fed up with the bullying that her son was receiving. She put together a group to go after this person. And ultimately what happened is she committed murder.
Tamara pleads not guilty and, in a surprising move, forgoes her right to a jury. Instead, she opts to leave her fate in the hands of the judge.
I think the defense strategy was pretty clear. They opted for a bench trial before Judge Alan Anderson in King County, and their main thrust was arguing that Branch was, she was guilty. Not of first-degree murder, but of second-degree murder.
She kept on the stand crying and saying like she just wanted people to stop messing with her son, but my brother didn't go to your school with your son. My brother didn't know your son. So the fact that you're trying to play like, oh, I just wanted to protect him, like, get that out of here. Like, no, you were upset because he got beat up and then you did what you wanted to do.
But prosecutors aren't buying her story.
It was clear to me that while she knew what she had done was wrong, that she did not want to accept legal responsibility for the acts that she had perpetrated upon John Keys by killing him in such a brutal and heinous way. Second-degree murder is when you commit first-degree murder, but you do it under a sudden and intense passion. Her son having been punched is not a serious provocation under Illinois law.
I believe that she put all the anger from every fight that her son ever had in his life, or every time he got beat up, into one person. And that just unfortunately happened to be my brother.
On November 9th, 2011, the judge finds Tamara guilty and sentences her to 34 years in prison.
I do not feel like that's justifiable. My brother could never come back. You know, he's gone for having a fight with your son. So that's nothing. I feel like you get more time for selling dope than murder. And that's just the way this world is.
30 years? Come on now, not enough time. I believe they should have been 50 plus, minimum 50.
The following year, in May of 2012, Tamara's son LeCorbic decides not to go to trial. Instead, he pleads guilty to a reduced charge.
The plea offer that we offered to LeCorbic, we offered to amend the charge to a conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, which is a lower charge, obviously, than first-degree murder.
As I get older, I had to put myself in his shoes as a 16-year-old kid, and your mom is telling you, go him up, go do it. I don't think I would have had the strength to deny my mom or tell her no. If that was what was happening at the time, I believe I would have did what my mom told me to do.
We also took into account the motive and who was the one who had instigated this crime, and that was definitely LeCorbic's mother, Tamara. And we also took into account LeCorbic's young age. So he was not the one that was the principal. He was kind of being pushed into this and really kind of being bullied into it by his mother at that point in time. We offered him to be sentenced to 15 years in prison. He was required to serve 7.5 years of that.
LeCorbic Binion was released after serving his sentence.
I was scrolling through Facebook one day, and the people you may know, his picture, it just, the way it felt in my stomach, it just, like, I hurried up and blocked this so I could never see that again. Like, it just did something else to me that I didn't even know was there.
Tamara Branch is serving out her sentence at the Logan Correctional Center in Lincoln, Illinois. She is eligible for parole in 2043 at the age of 71.
As a parent myself, it hurts to see your child or your children suffer, and you want to protect them in any way you can, but cooler heads need to prevail, and violence does not solve anything, ever.
There's a man upstairs called God that I lean on him every day. And I just ask for strength to get me through it, but I hurt every day. I miss my son. His birthday is about to come up, which he would be 30. And it's hard.
Everybody loved Lil Jon, and it just really, really put a blackness in my heart that I have to deal with for the rest of my life. I think it's one of the stupidest things out here that a person can do, to go out there and seek revenge, because, for number one, I'm a God-fearing man. The Lord says, vengeance is mine. And number two, in my case, I got 4 daughters just to watch over. You know, they don't have a brother no more.
The whole cycle is unfortunate because nobody really wins. Everybody winds up dead or hurt. And so I've learned to really stop and think before I act. Really stop and think.
Violence don't prove anything. Is this something you really want to do? What's going to come behind it? Who's going to be hurt behind it? What you lose? I mean, she hurt. She in jail. She can't see her kids. I'm hurt. I can't see my son no more. I got to go to the graveyard to see him.
Rest in heaven, brother. I miss you. I love you.
The first time the police truly understood what they were dealing with, it wasn't in a courtroom, and it wasn't in a press conference. It was in the thick, choking silence of a pig farm on the outskirts of Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, where the air carried a strange mixture of damp earth, animal waste, and something far heavier that no one at first wanted to name. It was late winter turning into early spring, the kind of cold that clings to metal fences and seeps into your bones even when you are wearing gloves, even when you tell yourself you are just doing your job. The officers arrived expecting a search, maybe some suspicious activity, maybe a tip that would go nowhere like so many others before it. What they did not expect was the feeling that the ground itself seemed unwilling to give up what it had been holding for years. The farm looked ordinary from a distance, almost banal in the way rural properties often do when they sit quietly at the edge of a city that pretends not to notice them. Barns, pens, muddy paths carved by years of heavy boots and hooves. A place built for animals, not questions. And yet the questions were already there, heavy in the minds of investigators who had been circling this name for too long without ever being able to pin it down to anything solid. Robert William Picton was, on paper, nothing remarkable. A pig farmer. A man who kept to himself. Someone neighbors described in fragments rather than full portraits, because there was never enough interaction to form a complete picture. He moved through the world like a shadow that belonged to the landscape rather than a man who imposed himself upon it. But that, as the investigators would later realize, was part of what made everything so difficult to see. The most dangerous thing about him was not what he did loudly, but what he did quietly, in spaces where no one thought to look too closely. In Vancouver's downtown east side, long before the farm became the center of attention, women had begun to disappear. Not all at once. Not in a way that would trigger immediate alarm across the entire system. One by one, in intervals that allowed each case to be categorized separately, filed separately, explained separately. The neighborhood itself was already a place where society placed its blind spots. Poverty, addiction, survival, sex work, homelessness. These were not environments where missing persons reports always carried urgency. Families would call. Friends would insist something was wrong. But the system, overloaded and desensitized, often responded with procedural delay rather than immediate action. And so the disappearances accumulated like small cracks in glass that no one bothered to trace back to their origin. At first, there was no pattern officially recognized. That is the part that haunts investigators in hindsight. Not the violence itself, but the absence of connection. The inability to see that separate stories were actually chapters of the same hidden narrative. Each woman had a name, a life, routines that briefly intersected with someone who would later be identified as a predator, though at the time he was just another figure moving through the same streets, the same bars, the same shadows where vulnerability and anonymity overlapped. Witnesses would later recall him in fragments too. A man who sometimes offered rides. A man who sometimes had money when others did not. A man who did not stand out in the loud way that would make people remember him clearly, but in the quiet way that made people forget to question him at all. That invisibility, that ability to blend into the texture of desperation without disrupting it, became one of the most critical elements of how he operated. When police finally began to look more closely, it was not because of a single breakthrough, but because of accumulation. Reports that began to repeat. Names that began to reappear in proximity to each other. Missing women who had last been seen in similar circumstances, in similar areas, sometimes even mentioning the same man in passing, though never with enough certainty to build a case. And still, nothing concrete. No smoking gun. No definitive crime scene. Only absence, repeating itself in different voices. Meanwhile, the farm remained a constant in the background, almost irrelevant at first glance. A working property. A place where pigs were raised, where machinery moved through mud, where smells were strong enough that outsiders rarely lingered. It was precisely this environment, investigators would later realize, that made it so effective as a place of concealment. Not hidden in the sense of secrecy, but hidden in the sense of normalization. Nothing about it invited deeper scrutiny from those who passed by. Even when rumors began to circulate, they existed in the same uncertain space as all urban legends do, half believed, half dismissed, never fully acted upon. The turning point did not arrive with a dramatic confession or a sudden revelation. It arrived slowly, almost reluctantly, as law enforcement agencies began to coordinate across jurisdictions and realized that what they had been treating as isolated disappearances might actually represent something far more structured. That realization carried a kind of weight that changed the atmosphere of the investigation. Suddenly, files that had been separate began to sit side by side. Photographs were compared. Timelines were aligned. And in that alignment, something deeply unsettling began to emerge. The possibility that a single individual had been intersecting with many of these lives in a consistent pattern over time. When attention finally narrowed toward Robert Pickton, it was not because he had been overlooked completely, but because he had never fully stood out enough to be prioritized. He existed in the margins of suspicion rather than its center. And margins, in large investigations, are where things can remain for years without resolution. The decision to search the farm was not made lightly. It came after pressure, after persistence, after the slow building of a sense among certain investigators that the answers, if they existed at all, would not be found in the city streets where the women disappeared, but somewhere quieter, further removed, where control could be exerted without interruption. When officers finally entered the property with warrants in hand, the experience was not immediately cinematic. There were no obvious dramatic signs at first. Just space. Large, open, layered with the everyday reality of rural labor. But as they moved deeper into the property, that sense of normality began to fracture. Small inconsistencies appeared. Areas that did not feel fully explained. Objects that seemed out of place not in an obvious way, but in a way that made trained investigators pause longer than they expected to. And then came the search areas that required excavation, where the earth itself began to yield evidence that no one present could fully process in the moment. What they uncovered was not just physical evidence, but a shift in understanding so profound that it redefined the scope of everything that had come before. This was no longer a series of missing persons cases. It was something else entirely, something that forced investigators to confront the possibility that what had been occurring was not incidental, not random, not peripheral, but sustained over a long period of time within a space that had remained largely unexamined. The psychological impact of that realization cannot be overstated. Officers who had entered the property expecting to close gaps in a file instead found themselves opening questions that would take years to fully process. Each discovery did not simply answer a question, it generated 10 more. And at the center of all of it was the growing recognition that someone had been operating in plain sight, within a structure that did not initially appear to conceal anything at all. That is where the horror of the story begins to take shape in its truest form, not in sudden violence, but in sustained invisibility. In the space between what is reported and what is noticed. In the gap between individual tragedy and collective recognition. And as the investigation deepened, one truth became increasingly unavoidable. The absence of earlier action was not due to a lack of suffering, but due to a failure to connect it in time. The city of Vancouver in the 1990s carried a strange duality that you could feel even without being told about it. On one side, glass towers rose against the Pacific sky, reflecting wealth, progress, and a carefully curated image of Canadian urban life. On the other side, just a short distance away, there was a neighborhood that seemed to exist in a different reality entirely, as if it had been forgotten by the city that surrounded it. That place was the downtown East Side. To understand what happened in this case, you cannot separate the crimes from the environment in which they were allowed to unfold. The streets of the downtown East Side were narrow, often damp from the constant coastal rain, and lined with aging buildings whose paint had long since peeled away under years of neglect. Neon signs flickered above storefronts that rarely seemed fully awake, even during the day. The air carried a mix of salt from the nearby harbor, exhaust from passing traffic, and something heavier, something that lingered in the corners of alleyways where sunlight struggled to reach. This was a neighborhood where survival often came before everything else. Many of the people who lived there were struggling with addiction, poverty, or homelessness. Some had left difficult family situations behind. Others had simply fallen through gaps in systems that were supposed to protect them. The result was a community of individuals who were visible in plain sight, yet often invisible in terms of societal attention. For many of the women who would later become connected to this case, life in the downtown East Side was defined by instability. Shelters were overcrowded, and affordable housing was nearly impossible to find. Some stayed in single-room occupancy hotels where walls were thin and locks were unreliable. Others slept in alleyways or moved constantly between temporary spaces, always aware that safety was fragile and could disappear at any moment. In the midst of this environment, disappearances did not always immediately stand out as extraordinary events. People came and went frequently. Some left voluntarily, seeking a different city or attempting to restart their lives elsewhere. Others simply drifted out of sight, their absence noted but not always fully investigated right away. It was a reality shaped by both social neglect and investigative overload, where police resources were stretched and cases involving marginalized individuals often did not receive immediate urgency. At the time, no one realized that a pattern was forming. There were families, however, who did notice. Mothers, siblings, friends, and children of missing women began to ask questions that slowly grew louder over time. They called shelters, hospitals, and police stations. They posted photographs on community boards and asked outreach workers if anyone had seen their loved ones. Some were told there was no new information. Others were advised to wait, as their cases were still under review. Waiting became a painful routine. For investigators working in the city, the situation was complicated. The Vancouver Police Department and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police each had roles in different parts of the region, and communication between agencies was not always seamless. Reports of missing persons were sometimes handled individually rather than being compared across databases in real time. This meant that potential connections between cases could remain hidden unless someone actively searched for them. At first, there was no clear indication that the disappearances were linked at all. Each case appeared isolated. Different timelines, different last known sightings, different personal histories. On paper, there was nothing to suggest a single explanation. But beneath that surface level of randomness, something was beginning to take shape. In the surrounding rural outskirts of British Columbia, there were areas of land that stretched far beyond the city's edge. Dense forests, muddy trails, and abandoned industrial zones created a landscape where visibility was limited and human presence was sparse. These areas were not unusual for the region, but they provided something important in this investigation: space where activity could go unnoticed. For most people living in Vancouver, these rural spaces were distant, almost abstract. They were places you passed through on the way to somewhere else, not destinations themselves. Yet for someone moving between city and countryside, they offered isolation that could conceal nearly anything. During this period, there was also a growing sense of vulnerability among women working or surviving in the downtown East Side. Many relied on informal networks for safety, letting friends know where they were going or who they were meeting. Some carried small objects for protection, while others developed strategies for avoiding dangerous situations. But the unpredictability of daily life meant that not every risk could be anticipated. It was within this fragile ecosystem that individuals like Robert Pickton operated. At first glance, Pickton did not fit the conventional image of a serial offender. He lived on a pig farm in Port Coquitlam, a rural community located outside Vancouver. The farm itself was large, sprawling across acres of land filled with barns, pens, and open fields. From a distance, it appeared to be a working agricultural property, the kind of place that blended into the rural landscape without drawing much attention. The people who knew of the farm saw it as unremarkable, a quiet operation, a place associated with livestock, machinery, and long stretches of routine labor. There was nothing outwardly dramatic about it, and that lack of visibility became one of its most significant features. Pickton himself was described by some as unassuming, even awkward in social interactions. He was not someone who naturally drew attention in public settings. He moved through spaces without leaving a strong impression, which made him difficult to read for those who encountered him casually. But behind that ordinary exterior, something deeply disturbing was unfolding. As the years progressed, the number of missing women associated with the downtown East Side continued to grow. At first, the disappearances were treated as separate incidents. Some individuals were categorized as voluntarily missing. Others were thought to have overdosed or relocated. The possibility of a coordinated pattern was not yet fully recognized. Families, however, began to notice similarities that official reports did not always highlight. Many of the missing women shared overlapping circumstances. They had been seen in the same neighborhoods. They had connections to similar social circles. And in several cases, they had last been seen in the company of unfamiliar men shortly before disappearing. These observations created growing frustration among relatives who felt that the urgency of the situation was not being fully matched by investigative action. Public pressure slowly began to build, but it would take time before that pressure translated into structural change in how the cases were approached. Meanwhile, life in the downtown East Side continued under difficult conditions. Outreach workers moved through the neighborhood, trying to provide support where possible. Shelters operated at capacity. Health services attempted to manage both physical and psychological needs of a population dealing with overlapping crises. Despite these efforts, the environment remained unstable, and individuals could still vanish without immediate explanation. In rural Port Coquitlam, life continued in a different rhythm. The pig farm operated on a cycle dictated by feeding schedules, maintenance work, and the care of animals. The distance between this rural world and the urban struggles of Vancouver created a separation that would later prove significant in the investigation. What made this case particularly difficult in its early stages was the absence of a clear trigger event. There was no single moment that immediately alerted authorities to the scale of what was happening. Instead, it was a slow accumulation of disappearances, each one adding to a pattern that only became visible in hindsight. At the time, no one could say with certainty whether these cases were connected. There were theories, of course, as there always are in missing persons investigations. Some suggested random violence. Others pointed to transient lifestyles and the risks associated with unstable environments. But none of these explanations fully accounted for the number of disappearances over time. It was only when investigators began to step back and review multiple cases side by side that the structure of something more organized began to emerge. Still, even then, there was resistance to the idea that a single individual could be responsible for such a wide range of missing persons reports without detection. The concept seemed too large, too hidden, too unlikely to have gone unnoticed for so long. And yet, as the investigation would eventually reveal, the most troubling crimes are often the ones that blend into the background of everyday life so completely that they do not initially appear to be crimes at all. In this environment of uncertainty, the stage was set for one of the most disturbing investigations in Canadian history to slowly come into focus. Before any investigation can truly understand the scale of a disappearance, it must first understand the people who vanished. In the downtown East Side, the women who would later be connected to this case were not defined by a single narrative. Each of them carried a life shaped by different choices, different struggles, and different attempts at survival in a city that rarely paused long enough to fully see them. Many of them had grown up in difficult circumstances. Some came from broken families where instability was present from an early age. Others had experienced foster care systems that moved them from place to place, never allowing them to fully root themselves in one environment. There were also women who had once lived completely different lives, with steady jobs, children, and homes, before circumstances such as addiction, trauma, or loss gradually pulled them into more precarious conditions. What united them was not their past, but their vulnerability in the present. In the downtown East Side, vulnerability was not always immediately visible in the way people carried themselves. Some women still showed resilience in their daily routines, navigating the streets with familiarity and awareness. Others moved with caution, always aware of risks that existed in both known and unknown forms. But beneath these differences, there was a shared reality. They lived in a space where safety could not always be guaranteed, and where trust had to be carefully measured. Friends and family members often described these women as complex individuals, not easily reduced to the labels that would later be used in official reports. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends. They laughed, argued, made plans, and tried to hold on to moments of stability whenever they could find them. Even in difficult circumstances, there were still routines that gave structure to their lives, however fragile those routines might have been. Some worked intermittently, taking temporary jobs when possible. Others relied on social assistance or informal economies to get by. Many navigated a constant balancing act between immediate survival and longer-term hopes that often remained out of reach. In conversations with loved ones, a common theme emerged. Disappearance rarely felt like a possibility until it suddenly became reality. A woman might be seen one day walking down a familiar street, stopping to talk with someone she knew, and then simply not return home that night. At first, this absence might not immediately raise alarm. In a community where instability was common, delays in contact were not unusual. But as hours turned into days, concern would begin to grow. Families would start making phone calls. They would visit shelters, hospitals, and known gathering places. They would ask outreach workers if anyone had seen their loved one recently. Often, these searches produced no immediate answers. Sometimes there were fragmented sightings, uncertain memories of someone being seen in a different part of the city. Other times, there was nothing at all. Over time, missing persons reports began to accumulate. Each report on its own appeared tragic, but isolated. A woman last seen near a bus stop. Another who had not returned to her shelter bed. Another who had been in contact with family and then suddenly stopped calling. In official records, these cases were logged separately, each with its own file number, its own timeline, its own set of incomplete details. For investigators, this fragmentation made it difficult to immediately recognize a pattern. There was no single point of connection that tied all of these disappearances together in an obvious way. The women came from different backgrounds, had different routines, and were last seen in different locations. Without clear physical evidence linking the cases, they remained, at least initially, individual mysteries. Yet within the community, something felt different. Friends who knew multiple women began to notice overlaps in the stories they were hearing. The same neighborhoods appeared repeatedly. Certain descriptions of unfamiliar men would surface in more than one account. There were mentions of individuals offering rides, invitations, or small amounts of money in exchange for companionship or time spent together. These details, while not definitive on their own, began to form subtle patterns when viewed collectively. Still, patterns alone were not enough to initiate a large-scale investigation. In many cases, the last known moments of these women's lives were reconstructed from fragmented information. A sighting outside a convenience store, a conversation in a bar, a brief encounter with someone who is never fully identified. Each detail was like a small piece of a larger puzzle, but without the full picture, it was difficult to know how they fit together. Families often described the emotional toll of this uncertainty. The waiting was not passive. It was filled with repeated attempts to find answers. Phone calls became daily routines. Flyers with photographs were posted on telephone poles, community centers, and shop windows. Some families organized small search efforts, walking through neighborhoods themselves, hoping for any sign or clue. In many of these accounts, there was a recurring sense of frustration directed not only at the unknown circumstances, but also at the lack of visible progress in official investigations. Relatives often felt that their loved ones were being treated as statistics rather than individuals whose lives mattered in a deeply personal way. Despite these frustrations, investigators were working within real limitations. The sheer number of cases, combined with limited resources and the complexity of urban policing, meant that not every disappearance could be treated with equal immediacy. At the time, there was still no confirmed indication that a single offender was responsible for multiple cases. This uncertainty created space for danger to remain undetected. Within the downtown East Side itself, life continued in a rhythm shaped by survival. The streets were constantly in motion. People moved between shelters, drop-in centers, and informal gathering spots. Conversations happened in passing, often brief, but meaningful. Information traveled quickly through word of mouth, but it was rarely complete. Some women who knew each other shared warnings about certain individuals or situations. They discussed safer routes, safer places, and safer times of day to move through the neighborhood. But even these strategies could not eliminate risk entirely. The unpredictability of daily life meant that no system of caution was foolproof. It was in this environment that the absence of these women began to accumulate into something more troubling than isolated incidents. Yet, even as concern grew, the true scope of what was happening remained hidden. What made this stage of the case so haunting in retrospect was how ordinary each individual disappearance initially appeared within its own context. There were no dramatic scenes that immediately signaled a serial pattern. Instead, there were quiet exits from the world, unnoticed by many at the time, but deeply felt by those who knew and loved the women who vanished. In hindsight, investigators would later realize that the warning signs had been present all along, scattered across different reports, waiting for someone to connect them. But at this point in the timeline, those connections had not yet been made, and the women who would eventually form the center of one of Canada's most disturbing serial murder investigations were still, officially, only missing. The first moments of violence in cases like this are rarely witnessed in full. What investigators later reconstruct is not a continuous scene, but fragments collected from memory, forensic traces, and the absence of what should have been there. In the disappearance of women linked to the downtown East Side, the moment of transition from everyday life to irreversible loss was almost always hidden behind something deceptively ordinary. A conversation, a walk, a decision to trust someone just a little longer than they should have. In multiple accounts, there was a recurring pattern that would only become clear much later. A woman would be in the city, often in familiar territory, when she encountered a man who did not immediately stand out as threatening. Sometimes he was quiet, sometimes polite, sometimes offering small gestures that felt harmless in isolation.
A ride,
A drink, a place to rest. In a world where fatigue and uncertainty were constant companions, these offers could appear as brief moments of relief. The shift, when it happened, was rarely visible from the outside. Witnesses who later spoke to investigators often described scenes that seemed unremarkable at first glance. A woman seen entering a vehicle, a conversation on a street corner, movement toward a more isolated area of the city or beyond it, into regions where streetlights became sparse and buildings gave way to open space. None of these moments, on their own, would have immediately suggested danger, but together, they formed a path that led away from visibility. What made this case particularly difficult to understand in its early stages was the absence of obvious force in many of the narratives. There were no consistent reports of loud struggles or public disturbances. Instead, there was a quiet disappearance of presence. One moment someone was there, and then they were not. For families, the absence felt unreal at first. A missed call, a delayed return, a night that stretched longer than expected. It was only when these hours turned into days that concern hardened into fear. Behind the scenes, there was another layer to these disappearances that investigators would only later begin to fully grasp. The environments in which these women were last seen often shared certain characteristics. They were transitional spaces, areas between neighborhoods, industrial zones, rural edges of the city, where human activity thinned out. These were places where surveillance was minimal, where witnesses were scarce, and where events could unfold without immediate interruption. It was in these spaces that the line between control and vulnerability became most significant. The man later identified in connection with these crimes, Robert Picton, operated in a world that appeared stable on the surface. His pig farm in Port Coquitlam was surrounded by rural land, distant enough from the city to feel disconnected from urban life, yet close enough that movement between the two was easy for someone who knew the area well. For those who passed by the property without knowing its significance, it looked like a functioning agricultural site. There were fences, barns, equipment, and animals. The sounds of rural labor blended into the natural environment, creating an impression of routine. Nothing about its exterior immediately suggested the scale of what would later be discovered. But the isolation of the farm was precisely what made it significant. Inside this environment, investigators would later conclude, interactions could occur without witnesses. Movement could go unnoticed. Time could stretch without interruption from the outside world. In cases involving vulnerable individuals, this separation from public view became a critical factor in what was possible. Forensic reconstruction of events suggested that once certain women entered this environment, the conditions shifted dramatically. Control became absolute not through public spectacle, but through isolation. The absence of external observation meant that what happened next left no immediate trace in the world beyond the property. When investigators later examined missing persons timelines, they began to notice that several women had last been seen in situations that suggested voluntary movement away from public spaces. Some had been seen entering vehicles. Others had been reported leaving known locations with individuals they appeared to trust, at least in the moment. This trust, whether given freely or under subtle pressure, became the entry point into the final phase of their lives. Inside the investigative files, the difficulty lay in reconstructing intent. Without direct witnesses or immediate physical evidence, it was impossible at first to determine whether these women had been coerced, deceived, or simply taken advantage of in moments of vulnerability. Each case required careful piecing together of fragmented information, much of which had been recorded long after the fact. As time passed, the absence of certain individuals began to form a pattern that was no longer easy to dismiss. Reports that once seemed isolated began to overlap in ways that could not be ignored. Locations repeated. Time frames clustered. Descriptions of a similar type of man began to appear across multiple accounts, though initially without enough detail to create a definitive identification. For families and friends, however, the emotional reality was already clear long before the investigative clarity arrived. The absence of their loved ones was not abstract. It was felt in empty rooms, unanswered phones, and routines that no longer made sense without the person who was missing. In some cases, personal belongings were left behind, reinforcing the suddenness of the disappearance. In others, there was nothing to hold on to except memory. As the investigation slowly developed, one of the most disturbing realizations was how long it had taken for these patterns to be recognized as connected. The fragmentation of early reports meant that by the time a broader picture began to form, years had already passed since the first disappearances. During that time, the environment of risk had remained unchanged. Women continued to move through the downtown East Side, navigating the same streets, encountering the same uncertainties. Outreach workers continued their efforts, while shelters remained at capacity. Police continued to respond to individual cases, each treated within its own frame, without yet fully integrating the broader implications. The absence of immediate connection between cases created a delay that, in hindsight, would become one of the most critical failures in understanding the scale of what was happening. But at the time, no single event had yet forced a full reevaluation of the situation. There was no dramatic turning point visible to the public. Instead, there was a gradual accumulation of missing persons reports, each one adding weight to an emerging pattern that remained just out of full recognition. And somewhere within that accumulation, a process of selection and repetition was unfolding that would eventually reveal itself as one of the most disturbing serial crime patterns in Canadian history. The discovery did not arrive as a sudden revelation, but as a slow intrusion into something that had already been quietly rotting beneath the surface of ordinary routines. It began with reports that seemed, at first, like isolated complaints in an otherwise familiar system. A storage facility in a quiet, industrial corner of the city. A manager who noticed a smell that did not belong to anything living in a healthy, controlled environment. At first, there was hesitation, because unpleasant odors in industrial spaces were not unusual. But this one was different. It lingered in a way that could not be ignored. By the time authorities were called, the concern had already turned into certainty that something was wrong. When officers arrived, they were immediately confronted by a sensation that was not just physical, but instinctive. The smell carried a weight that seemed to settle in the air, thick and unmistakable, triggering a response that went beyond professional training. It was the kind of odor that bypassed analysis and went straight to recognition. Something had died there. Something had been hidden. The storage unit itself appeared unremarkable from the outside, blending into the rows of similar units that lined the facility. Metal doors, numbered compartments, the quiet hum of a place designed for temporary forgetting. But this unit had been treated differently. There were signs of deliberate sealing, layers of material applied with purpose rather than carelessness. Plastic wrap had been pulled tightly across an object inside, and duct tape reinforced the containment in overlapping strips that suggested intent, not improvisation. Every detail of the exterior suggested that whatever was inside was not meant to be found easily. When investigators began to open the space, the reality inside forced a shift in perspective that no report could fully capture. The container they found was not just a hidden object. It was an attempt to erase something from the world entirely. A large garbage receptacle, the kind used in ordinary households, had been repurposed into something far more disturbing. It sat there as a contradiction, a mundane object turned into a vessel of concealment. As the seal was carefully broken, the air changed again. What had been contained for an unknown period of time was no longer held back by layers of plastic and tape. The smell intensified, and with it came the immediate understanding that this was not an accidental death, not a natural passing, but something that required explanation. Inside the container, investigators found human remains in a state that defied easy description. Time had altered the body in ways that made immediate identification impossible without forensic assistance. The environment inside the sealed container had created conditions that slowed and distorted natural decomposition, producing a scene that was both clinical and deeply unsettling at the same time. It was not just a body, it was evidence of prolonged concealment. The forensic team worked carefully, aware that every movement mattered. Samples were taken, observations recorded, and the container itself treated as a critical piece of evidence. The condition of the remains suggested that whoever had placed the body there had done so with intention and knowledge, not in panic or confusion. The sealing was too deliberate, too controlled, too complete. As the investigation expanded outward from the storage unit, attention turned immediately to identifying the victim. Among the items recovered was personal documentation that provided the first real anchor point in the case. A name emerged from within the chaos of decomposition and concealment, giving the remains an identity that shifted the entire nature of the investigation. This was no longer an unknown tragedy. It was a person who had once lived, moved, spoken, and been part of a community. The identification of Christine Smith transformed the case from an anonymous discovery into something far more complex. Once a name was attached to the remains, investigators were able to begin reconstructing the last known stages of her life. They discovered that the storage unit was linked to someone within her immediate family, specifically her daughter, which immediately introduced a layer of relational complexity that demanded closer scrutiny. At this stage, the scene was no longer just about the physical discovery. It became about relationships, timelines, and the space between presence and absence. Investigators began asking not only how Christine Smith had died, but how she had ended up in that sealed container, hidden away in a place designed for temporary storage rather than permanent disappearance. As they examined the unit further, additional materials were found that deepened the mystery. Objects that did not belong in a typical storage environment began to emerge, items that suggested a more unusual set of interests or behaviors. Books referencing occult themes and dark symbolic systems were discovered among the belongings. These materials did not provide answers on their own, but they introduced questions about mindset, belief systems, and psychological framing. At this point in the investigation, speculation began to form around whether the crime might involve ritualistic elements. The presence of symbolic literature, combined with the unusual manner of concealment, led some investigators to consider whether there was a belief-driven motivation behind the act. However, others cautioned against drawing conclusions too quickly, emphasizing that such materials could exist in many contexts without directly influencing criminal behavior. What remained undeniable, however, was the level of effort taken to ensure that the body would not be found easily. This was not a case of immediate disposal. It was a case of containment, delay, and concealment over time. As forensic analysis continued, another important factor emerged: the timeline of death. While exact determination was complicated by environmental conditions inside the sealed container, experts were able to establish that the body had been there for a significant period. This meant that the concealment had not been temporary. Whoever placed the body there had expected it to remain undiscovered for a long time. That realization shifted the investigation again. It suggested planning. It suggested awareness of consequences. It suggested that the act of concealment was not secondary to the act of death, but an integral part of the entire sequence. Meanwhile, attention turned toward the last known movements of Christine Smith before her disappearance. Interviews and records began to outline a fragmented timeline, one that pointed toward a transition from normal daily life into sudden absence. Neighbors, acquaintances, and individuals within her social environment were interviewed in an attempt to reconstruct the final days before she vanished from public view. Some described her as present, but gradually less visible. Others recalled tension within her immediate living situation, though details varied depending on perspective. What remained consistent was that at some point, she stopped appearing in places where she had previously been seen regularly. As investigators worked to connect these fragments, a central question emerged: whether Christine Smith's disappearance had been a sudden event or the result of a process that unfolded over time within a private space that few others had access to. At this stage, the discovery of the storage unit became the anchor point for everything that followed. It was the first physical confirmation that something had gone drastically wrong, transforming what might have been treated as a missing persons concern into a confirmed death investigation. But even with this confirmation, the full scope of what had occurred remained unclear. The identity of responsibility had not yet been firmly established. The storage unit linked back to a family connection, but that connection alone was not enough to explain the sequence of events that led to such a concealed and controlled outcome. What investigators knew at this point was limited but deeply significant. A body had been found. It had been deliberately hidden. The conditions of concealment suggested intent. And the identity of the victim placed the case within a personal network that would require careful and sustained examination. This discovery marked the moment when the investigation could no longer remain passive. It had become active, urgent, and increasingly complex, pulling together threads of personal history, forensic evidence, and behavioral patterns that would eventually reveal far more than what was initially visible inside a single storage unit. Once the identity of the victim was confirmed and the storage unit transformed from a mysterious anomaly into a confirmed crime scene, the investigation entered its most unstable phase. This was the point where certainty began to fracture into competing theories, where every new detail could either strengthen the case or pull it in an entirely different direction. Investigators were no longer dealing with a single unknown death. They were now standing at the edge of a network of relationships, financial records, and behavioral inconsistencies that demanded careful reconstruction. The first and most immediate focus was Brookie West, the daughter of Christine Smith and the individual directly linked to the storage unit lease. On paper, this connection alone did not prove guilt, but in practice, it placed her at the center of every investigative pathway. Detectives needed to understand her movements, her financial situation, her interactions with her mother, and, most importantly, the timeline of when Christine was last seen alive. When officers began tracing Brookie's recent activity, they quickly realized that she did not present a simple profile. She was not entirely absent from systems of record, yet she also did not maintain a fully transparent lifestyle that would make tracking straightforward. There were gaps in her documented movements, periods where her location was difficult to confirm, and overlapping addresses that suggested a life split between different environments. This fragmentation immediately raised questions, not because it proved wrongdoing, but because it complicated the reconstruction of events. Investigators then turned to the financial aspect of the case. Bank records revealed something that shifted the tone of the investigation significantly. They discovered that Social Security payments intended for Christine Smith had continued to be collected even after she was no longer visibly present in the community. The flow of money did not stop when the person it belonged to disappeared from public life. Instead, it continued moving through accounts associated with her daughter. This discovery introduced a motive that investigators could not ignore. It did not explain the method of death, but it provided a potential reason for concealment. Financial benefit alone does not prove murder, but it does create a framework in which concealment becomes more understandable as a deliberate act rather than an emotional reaction. As detectives expanded their inquiry, They began speaking with neighbors and individuals who had interacted with both Christine Smith and Brookie West over time. These interviews revealed a relationship that was not easily categorized. Some described moments of apparent closeness, where mother and daughter seemed to coexist peacefully within the same space. Others described tension that appeared to build over time, manifesting in restrictions, arguments, and shifts in control within the household. One of the most important aspects that emerged from these testimonies was the gradual disappearance of Christine Smith from public view. According to several accounts, she had once been visible in the neighborhood, moving through familiar routines and interacting with people around her. Then, over time, that visibility faded. At first, it was subtle. Fewer sightings, fewer conversations, eventually complete absence. When asked about this disappearance, Brookie West reportedly provided explanations that varied depending on the situation. At different times, she suggested that her mother had moved to live with another relative, or that she was being cared for elsewhere due to health-related concerns. These explanations were not immediately verifiable, and in a community where frequent movement was not uncommon, they did not initially raise immediate alarm. However, as investigators cross-checked these statements with external records, inconsistencies began to emerge. There was no clear documentation supporting the claim that Christine had been relocated to another household under care. No medical facility records confirmed long-term treatment. No consistent contact trail could be established that placed her alive beyond a certain point in time. This gap between narrative and documentation became one of the central issues in the investigation. At the same time, forensic analysis of the storage unit continued. The duct tape and sealing materials used on the container were subjected to microscopic examination. Investigators were looking for traces that could link physical evidence to specific individuals or environments. What they found was not immediately conclusive in isolation, but it added another layer of complexity to the case when combined with other findings. One particularly significant discovery involved trace materials that suggested repeated handling of the sealing surface. This indicated that the container had not been sealed in a single, rushed moment. Instead, it appeared to have been carefully wrapped and secured, potentially in stages, reinforcing the idea of deliberate concealment rather than spontaneous disposal. As this physical evidence developed, investigators also began reconstructing the final known timeline of Christine Smith's life. They attempted to identify the last confirmed sighting, the last known interaction, and the point at which she effectively disappeared from all external observation. This process required interviewing individuals who had not seen her in months or even years, relying on memory that was often fragmented or uncertain. Despite these challenges, a general timeline began to form. Christine Smith had been gradually removed from public visibility over a period of time, rather than disappearing in a single documented event. This raised critical questions about whether her absence had been noticed internally within the household before it became externally apparent. Meanwhile, Brookie West's behavior during this period became a subject of intense scrutiny. Investigators noted that she had maintained financial control over accounts associated with her mother, while simultaneously limiting external contact with her. Friends who attempted to reach Christine reported difficulty doing so, often receiving explanations that did not align with each other over time. These patterns did not constitute direct proof of homicide, but they contributed to a growing profile of control and concealment that investigators could not ignore. As the investigation deepened, attention also turned to the broader behavioral context. The relationship between mother and daughter, as described by witnesses, was not stable in a traditional sense. It fluctuated between dependence and conflict, between proximity and separation. Some witnesses described it as emotionally complex, shaped by long-standing family history and unresolved tension. In such environments, investigators are often cautious not to interpret emotional complexity as criminal intent. However, when combined with financial irregularities, physical concealment of a body, and inconsistent explanations regarding a person's whereabouts, the picture begins to shift from ambiguity toward suspicion. At this stage of the investigation, detectives faced a critical challenge. They needed to determine not just what happened, but when understanding of what happened first became possible within the household itself. If Christine Smith had died naturally and was later concealed, that would imply a different sequence of events than if her death was directly caused and then intentionally hidden from the beginning. The distinction between those scenarios would define the entire legal structure of the case. As investigators continued gathering information, they also began preparing for the possibility that this case might not be isolated. Although at this stage the focus remained on Christine Smith, early discussions within investigative circles hinted at concerns that similar patterns might exist in other missing persons cases connected to individuals within the same social or geographic environment. However, those broader connections were still speculative and had not yet been formally integrated into the active investigation. What remained clear, though, was that the case had moved far beyond a simple missing person report. It had become a layered investigation involving financial records, behavioral patterns, forensic evidence, and deeply personal relationships that spanned years. Each new piece of information did not resolve uncertainty. Instead, it expanded it, revealing that the truth behind Christine Smith's disappearance was embedded in a network of decisions, actions, and omissions that would require careful reconstruction before any final conclusions could be drawn. The breakthrough in the investigation did not arrive with sudden clarity. It came instead through accumulation, through the slow pressure of inconsistencies that finally became too heavy to ignore. For months, investigators had been working with fragments, financial records, witness statements, forensic traces, and a timeline that refused to align neatly into a single explanation. But at a certain point, those fragments began to converge in a way that changed the entire direction of the case. The first decisive shift came from forensic evidence recovered at the storage unit. While the discovery of Christine Smith's remains had already confirmed a homicide investigation, it was the microscopic analysis of the sealing materials that created the first real structural link to a suspect. Among the layers of plastic and duct tape, investigators recovered trace impressions that could not be explained by environmental contamination or random contact. These were patterns created by repeated handling, pressure, and placement. When forensic analysts isolated latent fingerprints from the interior surfaces of the wrapping, the result was unexpected in its clarity. One of those prints matched Berkey West. Not a partial or ambiguous trace, but a usable identification point that placed her directly in contact with the container after it had been prepared for concealment. This detail alone did not reconstruct the entire sequence of events, but it changed the evidentiary foundation. It confirmed physical involvement in the sealing process, which implied knowledge of the body inside. From that moment, the investigation moved from circumstantial association to active evidentiary linkage. At the same time, financial records that had initially raised suspicion became even more significant when placed alongside this forensic development. Investigators confirmed that Social Security benefits intended for Christine Smith had continued to be collected after she had effectively disappeared from public view. The continuity of these payments suggested not only concealment, but maintenance of identity in administrative systems that still recognized her as alive. This created a powerful contradiction. A person officially alive in financial records, but physically absent from the world, and ultimately discovered in a concealed state of decomposition. When these two elements were combined, the forensic evidence and the financial trail began to form a coherent narrative structure. It was no longer a series of isolated irregularities. It was a sustained pattern of concealment that required active participation over time. Investigators then returned to witness interviews with renewed focus. Statements that had once seemed fragmented now revealed a clearer shape when re-examined in light of the forensic findings. Neighbors who had described Christine's disappearance as gradual were now understood as describing a process of controlled absence rather than simple relocation. One of the most significant aspects that emerged during this phase was the timeline of disappearance itself. Christine Smith had not simply vanished in a single moment. Instead, her presence in the community had been reduced incrementally until there was nothing left that could be independently verified. This gradual erasure made it difficult for external observers to identify the exact point at which normal life ended and concealment began. Within investigative teams, this realization was critical. It meant that the act under investigation was not limited to a single violent event, but potentially extended across a longer period of time involving decisions made before, during, and after death. At this stage, Brookie West became the central figure in all analytical models of the case. Her movements, her access to financial accounts, her control over residential spaces, and her proximity to the storage unit all aligned in a way that could not be dismissed as coincidental. However, investigators still needed to establish intent beyond reasonable doubt. Physical presence alone was not sufficient to prove homicide. To address this, forensic psychologists and behavioral analysts were brought into the investigation. Their task was not to determine guilt, but to interpret patterns of control, concealment, and relational dynamics within the household. What they identified was a structure in which one individual maintained increasing control over both physical space and external perception of reality. According to their analysis, the suppression of external contact, combined with financial management and narrative inconsistency regarding Christine's whereabouts, suggested a deliberate effort to construct an alternative version of events that could withstand casual scrutiny. This did not by itself prove cause of death, but it supported the theory of intentional concealment following a critical incident. As this analytical framework developed, investigators also revisited the storage unit itself. A more detailed reconstruction of how the container had been prepared suggested that the sealing process required time, materials, and familiarity with concealment techniques. The precision of the wrapping indicated that this was not a spontaneous reaction, but a structured action performed with awareness of what needed to be hidden and how long it needed to remain undiscovered. At this point, the investigation reached its most important interpretive threshold. The question was no longer whether Brookie West had been present at the scene of concealment. That had already been established through forensic evidence. The question now was whether she had participated in the act of death itself, or whether her involvement began after the fatal event occurred. This distinction became the central focus of prosecutorial strategy. To strengthen their case, investigators reconstructed a narrower timeline immediately surrounding Christine Smith's final confirmed period of life. They identified the last external interactions, the last financial activities in her name that could be independently verified, and the point at which her presence effectively ceased to be externally observable. From that point forward, all activity attributed to her was mediated through Brookie West's actions or statements. This created a closed loop of information where external verification was no longer possible without internal cooperation. In legal terms, this kind of control over narrative and access is often interpreted as a key indicator of concealment behavior. As the breakthrough phase solidified, investigators prepared for formal charges. The combination of forensic fingerprint evidence, financial irregularities, witness testimony, and behavioral analysis formed a multi-layered evidentiary structure that could be presented in court. However, even at this stage, there remained unanswered questions about the exact moment of death and the precise mechanism by which Christine Smith died. The condition of the remains, altered by time and containment, made it difficult to determine cause of death with absolute certainty. This uncertainty would later become a critical point in legal proceedings, but at this moment, investigators believed they had enough to move forward. What they did have was a confirmed identity, a confirmed concealment, a confirmed financial exploitation pattern, and a confirmed physical link between the suspect and the container in which the body was found. For the first time since the discovery of the storage unit, the case had moved from uncertainty into structured prosecution. The evidence did not answer every question, but it answered enough to change the status of the investigation from exploratory to accusatory. And in that shift, the case reached the point where legal systems would now take over from investigative reconstruction, carrying the weight of unresolved details into the courtroom where interpretation would become just as important as evidence itself. The courtroom in New Westminster was already full long before the judge entered. Reporters filled every available seat, cameras angled carefully, waiting for moments that would later be replayed across national television. Outside, the air was cold and damp in that quiet British Columbia way, but inside, the atmosphere felt heavier than weather could explain. It was the weight of years, of names, of missing posters, of families who had learned to live in the absence of answers. Robert William Pickton sat at the defense table in a plain suit that looked slightly too large for his frame. He did not look like what people expected a monster to look like. That was part of the discomfort. There was nothing theatrical about him. No dramatic expression. Just a man who occasionally shifted in his chair, looking at nothing in particular, as though the entire process was happening somewhere slightly removed from him. Across the aisle, prosecutors arranged binders filled with photographs, forensic reports, and witness statements. Each folder represented a life interrupted. Each page was a fragment of something that had once been a person with routines, laughter, arguments, plans that never made it past a certain point in time. When the Crown began its closing arguments, the room changed posture. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but everyone leaned in slightly, as if sound itself had become denser. They did not begin with shock. They began with pattern. A pattern of disappearances that stretched across years. Women who came from Vancouver's downtown east side, a place already carrying the burden of neglect, addiction, poverty, and survival. Women who were often reported missing, but not always immediately believed. Women whose absence did not always trigger urgency in the systems meant to protect them. The prosecutor spoke slowly, deliberately, letting silence do part of the work. He described how names had been recorded in police files, then filed away, then revisited too late. He described how, one by one, the same kind of story appeared. Last seen leaving the same area, last seen heading toward the same general orbit of vulnerability. And then he brought the jury back to the farm. The Pickton property in Port Coquitlam was not a house in the way jurors were used to imagining homes. It was land, expansive, cluttered, layered with structures that served unclear purposes. On the surface, it had once functioned as a pig farm. But beneath that surface, investigators would later describe a place that seemed designed to swallow attention. When search teams finally entered the property years earlier, they did not find answers neatly arranged. They found fragments. They found traces that resisted immediate explanation. They found evidence that suggested not just death, but repetition. A cycle that had continued while the world outside assumed randomness. The prosecution walked the jury through those discoveries with precision. Each item was not just physical evidence, but contextual proof of control, of concealment, of time passing without interruption. The defense, however, would challenge everything that could be challenged. Their argument was not that nothing had happened on the farm. That would have been impossible to maintain in the face of forensic evidence already presented. Instead, they focused on uncertainty, on limits, on what could not be definitively attributed to a single individual beyond reasonable doubt. They reminded the jury of the scale of the property, of the number of people who could have come and gone over years, of the fact that rural environments are difficult to fully map backward in time. They emphasized gaps in surveillance, gaps in documentation, gaps in certainty. And then they returned repeatedly to the same phrase, reasonable doubt. But the emotional weight of the trial was never just in legal phrasing. It was in what could not be avoided. The families of missing women sat in the gallery throughout much of the proceedings. Some held photographs. Some simply sat with hands folded tightly, as if stillness itself was a form of endurance. There were moments when testimony referred to unnamed victims, and in those moments, some family members would quietly begin to cry, not loudly, not theatrically, but in the exhausted way grief sometimes arrives after being delayed for too long. Witnesses had included forensic experts who described the painstaking work of identifying remains, dental records, DNA comparisons. In some cases, partial identification was all that could be achieved. In others, certainty arrived late, but it arrived nonetheless. The jury listened as the science was explained without embellishment. Time of death estimates, soil analysis, biological degradation patterns. The language of forensic pathology, stripped of emotion, yet still carrying emotional consequences in every conclusion. There was one moment during testimony that seemed to settle into the room differently than the others. A forensic specialist described how certain remains indicated prolonged exposure, how decomposition patterns suggested concealment rather than immediate exposure to natural elements. The implication was not stated dramatically. It did not need to be. The jury understood what it meant when bodies were not simply left, but hidden. The idea of concealment carried its own psychological weight. It suggested awareness, decision, continuation. When the prosecution finished, there was no applause, no visible reaction beyond the subtle shift of people adjusting in their seats, as if trying to process something that did not resolve neatly into comprehension. The judge then instructed the jury. The legal instructions were precise, careful, structured to prevent emotional interference from overriding evidentiary standards. The jurors were told to consider each charge separately, to evaluate evidence without speculation, to avoid assumptions not supported by testimony. And then they were taken into deliberation. Inside the jury room, there were no cameras, no reporters, no public record of the exact words exchanged. But what was known later was that the discussion was not quick. It unfolded over days, moving between certainty and hesitation, between forensic detail and the human reality behind it. Jurors reportedly struggled most with scale, with the idea that multiple lives could be connected through patterns rather than isolated incidents, with the challenge of separating what was emotionally obvious from what was legally provable. Outside the courthouse, families waited. Some returned home and came back again. Some could not stay in one place for too long. Waiting itself had become its own form of exhaustion. When the verdict was finally reached, the courtroom filled again. The atmosphere was different now. Not tense in the way of uncertainty, but compressed, like air before release. Robert Pickton was brought in. He sat down. He did not look toward the gallery. He did not search for faces. He looked forward, then slightly downward, waiting. The foreperson stood. Guilty. The word did not echo. It landed, heavy and immediate. One by one, the remaining verdicts were read, each one adding weight to the air already present, each one confirming what the prosecution had argued, that this was not a sequence of unrelated tragedies, but a connected pattern of violence. There were gasps from the gallery. Not loud, not chaotic, but involuntary. Some people covered their mouths. Others closed their eyes. A few simply stared straight ahead, as if trying to anchor themselves to something stable in the room. Pickton showed little visible reaction. His expression remained unchanged, though his hands shifted slightly on the table. The judge thanked the jury for their service. The formalities continued, but the emotional core of the moment had already passed. Sentencing came later, but the outcome was already understood in that moment. Life imprisonment without parole eligibility for many years. A legal conclusion to a case that had, for families, begun long before any courtroom existed. Outside, reporters rushed to microphones. Words like historic, unprecedented, and largest serial murder case in Canadian history were repeated in different orders, trying to capture what had just concluded. But for many families, the verdict was not closure. It was acknowledgement. Not resolution, but confirmation. That what they had suspected, feared, and fought to have recognized was real. And yet, even with conviction secured, something remained unresolved in a deeper sense. The trial had answered who was responsible in a legal framework, but it could not restore what had been lost. It could not reconstruct timelines that had already dissolved into memory. It could not return the missing to the spaces they had once occupied in everyday life. In the days that followed, attention would slowly shift away from the courtroom. News cycles would move forward. Headlines would fade into archives. But for those directly connected, the case did not end. It simply changed form. It became memory. It became absence with definition. It became a story that had finally been named, even if it could never be fully understood. After the courtroom emptied and the cameras were packed away, what remained was not silence, but something heavier and less defined. It was the kind of quiet that settles after a long storm, when the world is technically calm again, but nothing inside it feels fully repaired. For the families of the missing women, the verdict had done something complicated. It had ended uncertainty in a legal sense, but it had also forced permanence onto grief. Before the trial, there had always been a small space for hope, however fragile it was, that somewhere, somehow, a different explanation might exist. After the conviction, that space closed. What replaced it was certainty, without comfort. In Vancouver's downtown east side, life continued in its usual rhythm, but the awareness of what had happened nearby lingered like an invisible layer over the streets. The same corners where women once stood waiting, the same alleys where conversations began and ended quickly, now carried a different weight. People walked through those spaces with memory pressed quietly against their awareness, even if they never spoke about it aloud. For investigators and prosecutors, the case did not simply disappear after sentencing. It became a reference point, something studied and revisited. Not because it was solved in a satisfying way, but because it revealed how long a pattern of harm can exist before systems recognize it as a pattern at all. There were questions that continued to circulate in academic discussions and police training rooms. How many early warnings were missed because victims came from marginalized communities. How many reports were categorized as isolated incidents instead of connected events. How institutional attention can fragment when the people involved are already socially invisible. These questions did not have single answers. They existed as uncomfortable reflections of how the investigation unfolded over years instead of months. In the years after the trial, the case file itself became something larger than its original purpose. It was no longer just a legal record. It became a lesson in delayed recognition. A case study in how investigative focus can drift when evidence is scattered and victims are not immediately linked in public perception. Forensic specialists continued to refer to the case when discussing the challenges of identifying remains in rural or concealed environments. The difficulty was not only technical, but temporal. Time itself had been part of the concealment. Decomposition, environmental exposure, and fragmentation had all contributed to making identification a slow and often incomplete process. But beyond the forensic and procedural discussions, there was something more human that remained unresolved. Families still measured time in terms of before and after disappearance. Birthdays were still marked, even in absence. Names were still spoken in private spaces where no official confirmation could soften the emotional impact of loss. Some relatives described the trial not as closure, but as a transition from not knowing to knowing something unbearable. That shift did not reduce pain, it only gave it structure. Meanwhile, the figure at the center of the case, Robert William Pickton, became legally defined but emotionally distant. The trial had fixed him in place within the justice system, but it could not fully contain the psychological questions that continued to follow the case. How someone could maintain such a prolonged pattern of harm without earlier interruption. How vulnerability can be systematically targeted without immediate detection. How long it takes for absence to be recognized as signal rather than noise. These questions extended beyond one individual. They reached into systems, communities, and assumptions about visibility. Over time, the case also influenced public awareness campaigns and discussions about missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. The recognition that many of the victims came from marginalized backgrounds forced a broader conversation about inequality in protection, reporting urgency, and societal attention. It became increasingly clear that the tragedy was not only in what was done, but in how long it took for it to be fully acknowledged. In quiet moments, some investigators who had worked on the case reflected on the weight of retrospective clarity. Looking back, patterns seemed obvious. But at the time, those same patterns had been dispersed across different files, different jurisdictions, different assumptions about what constituted urgency. That fragmentation allowed the case to unfold over years, without full consolidation. For the public, the story eventually moved from front-page news to historical reference. But within that transition, something important remained. The recognition that systems built to protect can also miss, delay, and overlook when signals are not immediately connected. And yet, even within that recognition, there was no simple resolution. Because understanding the failure did not undo its consequences. The land where many of the discoveries were made remained physically unchanged. Grass still grew. Seasons still passed. But for those who knew its history, the space carried a different meaning. Not visible to the eye, but present in memory. The families who endured the longest part of this story learned something that cannot be easily summarized. That justice, when it arrives after years of uncertainty, does not erase absence. It only changes its context. For some, that meant learning to speak the names of loved ones in a different tense. For others, it meant avoiding certain conversations entirely because language itself felt insufficient. And for those who studied the case from the outside, it became a reminder that criminal investigations are not only about identifying perpetrators, but also about recognizing patterns of vulnerability before they accumulate into irreversible outcomes. In the end, the story does not close in a traditional sense. It settles. It becomes part of legal history, part of forensic training, part of public memory. But it does not resolve emotionally in a way that feels complete. What remains is awareness. Awareness of how easily certain lives can be overlooked in systems designed to notice only when patterns become undeniable. Awareness of how long silence can last before it is interrupted. Awareness that justice, while necessary, often arrives late enough that it shares space with grief rather than replacing it. And in that shared space, the most lasting impact of the case continues to exist, not in verdicts or sentences, but in the permanent reminder that absence is not always immediate. Sometimes it is gradual, sometimes it is ignored, and sometimes it only becomes visible when it is already too late to change its course. In the years after the case faded from headlines, the questions it left behind continued to circulate in quieter, more persistent ways. Not in the form of breaking news or courtroom drama, but in training seminars, policy reviews, and conversations between investigators who had worked too many cases like it, where clarity only arrived after irreversible loss. What made the case so difficult to forget was not only the scale of harm, but the structure of how it went unnoticed for so long. It forced a difficult reflection on how systems interpret absence. When someone disappears from a marginalized community, especially from environments already marked by poverty, addiction, and instability, the urgency of that disappearance is often filtered through bias, resource limitations, and fragmented reporting structures. In this case, those filters did not just delay resolution. They shaped the entire timeline of recognition. Within police departments across Canada, the case became part of a broader institutional memory. It was referenced when discussing how missing persons files are prioritized, how cross-jurisdictional communication can fail, and how patterns can remain invisible when data is not centralized. It was not presented as a single failure point, but as a chain of small, disconnected oversights that only became visible when viewed in hindsight. For forensic specialists, the case continued to be studied for what it revealed about evidence recovery in environments affected by decomposition, concealment, and time. The challenges were not only scientific but logistical. When remains are discovered long after death, the body becomes a record of environmental interaction rather than a clear snapshot of cause and sequence. That complexity often limits certainty, and in this case, certainty was something investigators had to rebuild piece by piece. But beyond the institutional lessons, there remained the human dimension that no procedural review could fully contain. Families of the victims continued to live with the dual reality of recognition and absence. The legal system had identified responsibility, but it could not reconstruct daily life, conversations, or future moments that were never allowed to occur. What remained was memory shaped by interruption, birthdays that continued without presence, voices that were recalled rather than heard, photographs that became substitutes for ongoing experience. Some family members described a shift that happened after conviction, not as closure, but as redefinition. Before the case was resolved, their grief was suspended in uncertainty. Afterward, it became fixed in knowledge. That transition changed the emotional texture of loss, but did not reduce its weight. There were also broader societal conversations that emerged in the wake of the case, particularly around how violence against vulnerable populations is recorded and responded to. Advocacy groups emphasized that the victims in this case were not incidental to the outcome, but central to understanding why the pattern persisted for so long. Their social positioning influenced how quickly they were missed, how slowly they were connected, and how late the full scope of harm was recognized. This led to increased attention on the systemic conditions surrounding missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. The case became one reference point among many, illustrating how vulnerability is not only individual but structural. It highlighted how risk accumulates when poverty, marginalization, and social invisibility intersect with institutional delay. At the same time, there was caution among professionals not to reduce the case to a single narrative of failure. It was not simply that systems did not work. It was that they worked inconsistently, and that inconsistency had consequences that were not immediately visible until much later. Inside correctional and legal environments, the individual at the center of the case remained defined by conviction, but not fully understood beyond it. The legal outcome provided accountability, but it did not provide psychological clarity. The motivations, internal reasoning, and emotional state behind prolonged patterns of harm remained subjects of analysis rather than resolution. That absence of full understanding is part of what continues to make the case studied. Not because it offers closure, but because it resists it. Even in academic discussion, the case is often framed not as an endpoint, but as a warning structure. A demonstration of how multiple small failures can align over time into something far larger than any single point of breakdown. It is used to illustrate the importance of data linkage, interagency communication, and early pattern recognition in missing persons investigations. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of the case is not procedural at all. It is the reminder it leaves behind about visibility. Visibility is not only about being seen. It is about being recognized as part of a pattern before that pattern becomes undeniable through tragedy. In this case, recognition came late, and the cost of that delay became part of its historical weight. For those who lived through it directly, either as family members, investigators, or witnesses in court, the story does not exist as a closed chapter. It exists as something that continues to echo in different forms. In policy discussions, in training materials, in personal memory, in the quiet acknowledgement that some systems only fully understand what they missed after it is no longer possible to change the outcome. And so the case remains present, not as an active investigation, but as a lasting reminder embedded in multiple layers of Canadian criminal history. A reminder that absence, when not recognized early, does not remain static. It accumulates meaning over time. And once that meaning is finally acknowledged, it cannot undo what has already been lost, but it can influence how future absence is understood, interpreted, and responded to. There is a final layer to cases like this that rarely appears in official summaries or courtroom transcripts. It is not evidence. It is not verdict. It is what remains in people after the case is officially over. Years after the conviction, long after the media moved on, the memory of what happened does not behave like a finished story. It behaves more like something embedded in the collective awareness of a place. In British Columbia, particularly in Vancouver's downtown east side, the case became part of the invisible history that shapes how people move through certain streets, how they speak about certain risks, and how they understand who is most likely to be overlooked. For many outside observers, the case is remembered through numbers and headlines. But for those who lived closer to it, either geographically or emotionally, it is remembered through absence, through names that stopped appearing in familiar spaces, through routines that suddenly had gaps in them, through the realization that disappearance is not always immediately recognized as disappearance. In the years following the trial, community organizations continued to push for structural change, not only in policing but in social services, housing access, and addiction support. The argument was not just about preventing crime, but about preventing the conditions that allow certain people to become statistically invisible. The case had exposed a harsh reality. When vulnerability becomes normalized, delay becomes easier to justify. Within investigative circles, the case also became part of a longer discussion about how serial patterns are identified. One of the most difficult lessons was that connection does not always emerge from obvious forensic links. Sometimes it emerges from repetition across fragmented reports that were never initially designed to be viewed together. The absence of early linkage was not due to a single oversight, but to the structure of how information was stored and interpreted. That realization led to changes in how missing persons databases are structured in some jurisdictions, encouraging earlier cross-referencing between cases that might appear unrelated on the surface. But those changes, while important, came after the fact. They came after the pattern had already fully revealed itself in the most irreversible way possible. For the families, however, structural changes are distant concepts compared to lived experience. What remains with them is not policy evolution, but the passage of time without return. Some families continued to speak publicly, not for closure, but for recognition. Recognition that their loved ones were not isolated stories, but part of a broader pattern that should have been seen sooner. Others chose silence, not because the story ended, but because continuing to speak about it meant reliving the moment when uncertainty became permanence. Grief, in these cases, does not follow a linear path. It settles into cycles that are reactivated by anniversaries, news mentions, or even unrelated conversations that accidentally reopen old emotional spaces. There is also the uncomfortable truth that cases like this force into public awareness, that violence is often not distributed randomly but concentrated around vulnerability. That realization is not easy to sit with because it challenges assumptions about safety and risk. It forces a confrontation with how society values certain lives over others, even unintentionally, through patterns of attention and delay. The individual at the center of the case remains legally defined, but psychologically unresolved in public imagination. Even after conviction, questions about internal motivation, awareness, and intent continue to surface in discussions. Not because they change the legal outcome, but because they reflect a deeper human need to understand how sustained harm can occur without earlier interruption. Yet one of the most important lessons from the case is that explanation does not always equal resolution. Understanding the mechanics of what happened does not undo its impact. It only frames it differently. Over time, the case becomes less about a single person and more about a system of conditions that allowed multiple failures to align. Social invisibility, institutional fragmentation, delayed recognition, and the difficulty of connecting scattered information into a coherent warning all played roles in shaping the timeline of events. In that sense, the case continues to function as a warning structure within criminal justice discourse. Not a story of one anomaly, but a reminder of what happens when multiple vulnerabilities overlap without early detection. And still, even with all the analysis, there is something that resists full intellectual containment. It is the simple fact that behind every file, every report, every forensic conclusion, there was a human life that existed independently of how it was later categorized. Lives that had relationships, habits, routines, and presence in the world before becoming entries in an investigation. This is where the case ultimately settles. Not in answers and not in closure, but in a tension between knowledge and loss. The knowledge of what happened and the permanent absence of what could not be restored. For those who study it now, whether in criminology, law enforcement, or social policy, the case is often presented as a critical example of how patterns of harm can remain hidden in plain sight when viewed through fragmented systems. But for those who experienced its consequences directly, it remains something more personal, something that does not reduce easily into lessons. Because at its core, beyond all procedural analysis and retrospective understanding, the case is still about absence that was once avoidable and then became permanent. And that permanence is what remains long after every explanation has been given. When a case reaches the end of its legal journey, there is an assumption that it also reaches the end of its emotional and social journey. But in reality, what ends in court often continues elsewhere, in quieter spaces where there are no transcripts, no verdicts, and no formal closure. In the years following the resolution of this case, the physical locations connected to it slowly returned to ordinary life. Streets were repaved, businesses changed ownership, and daily routines resumed their usual rhythm. On the surface, nothing remained to indicate what had once been uncovered. Yet for those who knew the history, certain places never fully returned to neutrality. They carried memory in a way that could not be removed by time or change of scenery. The downtown East Side in Vancouver continued to exist as a place of both resilience and hardship. Community workers still walked the same blocks, still engaged with people facing addiction, homelessness, and instability. What changed was not the reality of the environment, but the awareness surrounding it. The case had forced a broader recognition that vulnerability is not abstract. It has geography. It has patterns. It has consequences when ignored. For investigators who had been involved in the original case, retirement or reassignment did not erase what they had seen. Many described a lasting shift in how they approached missing persons reports afterward. Not necessarily in procedure alone, but in instinct. A greater sensitivity to repetition. A reluctance to dismiss early indicators that might later reveal larger patterns. The case had altered their professional lens in ways that remained long after the files were closed. In academic settings, criminology programs began to reference the case more frequently, not as a sensational example of serial violence, but as a study in systemic delay. Students were encouraged to examine not only the actions of the offender, but the structure of response around him. The emphasis was on understanding how multiple institutions, each functioning within their own limits, can collectively fail to see what is gradually forming across time. One of the most difficult concepts that emerged from this analysis was the idea of distributed blindness. No single agency was fully responsible for the delay in recognition. Instead, information existed in fragments across different systems, never fully consolidated in a way that would have made the pattern immediately visible. It was only in retrospect that the coherence of the pattern became undeniable. This realization has since influenced how missing persons data is handled in several regions. Efforts towards centralized databases and improved interagency communication were, in part, shaped by the understanding that time is not just a factor in investigation, but an active variable that can conceal or reveal connections depending on how information is structured. But while systems may evolve, memory does not update itself in the same way. For families affected by the case, time did not function as resolution. It functioned as continuation. The absence of loved ones remained unchanged, regardless of legal outcomes or institutional reflection. Some families found ways to transform their grief into advocacy, speaking publicly about the need for earlier intervention in cases involving vulnerable populations. Others chose privacy, carrying their experiences internally without public expression. Both responses were forms of endurance. Neither was complete relief. There is also a quieter truth that exists in the aftermath of such cases, one that is less frequently discussed. It is the way in which awareness changes everyday perception. People begin to notice differently. A missing poster on a wall is no longer just paper. A news report about an unidentified case is no longer just information. It becomes part of a larger awareness that some disappearances are not isolated events, but part of broader social patterns that often go unrecognized until much later. This shift in perception is subtle but lasting. It does not always manifest as fear. Sometimes it manifests as attentiveness, a different way of seeing what once might have been overlooked. The case also left behind a broader ethical question that continues to circulate in discussions of criminal justice and social responsibility. How should societies allocate attention when vulnerability is unevenly distributed? How do institutions ensure that patterns involving marginalized individuals are recognized with the same urgency as those involving more socially visible populations? These questions do not have definitive answers, but they remain central to the legacy of the case. Not because they are unique to it, but because they were revealed so clearly through its progression. In the end, what remains is not a single narrative, but a layered understanding of how harm, delay, and recognition interact over time. The offender was convicted. The legal system fulfilled its function within the boundaries of available evidence. But the broader story extends beyond conviction. It extends into how communities remember, how systems adapt, and how absence continues to shape understanding long after official records stop expanding. And perhaps most importantly, it extends into the recognition that some of the most significant failures in such cases are not dramatic moments of collapse, but quiet accumulations of missed opportunities to see what was already forming in plain sight. That is the part of the case that does not end. There is a final way in which this case continues to exist, and it is not through court records, academic analysis, or media retrospectives. It exists in the way people now speak about absence, vulnerability, and recognition with a slightly different awareness than before. When the case first entered public consciousness, it was framed through shock. The scale of harm, the isolation of the crime scene, the delay in discovery, all of these elements were initially understood as extraordinary. But over time, as professionals studied the details more closely, it became clear that what made the case significant was not only its extremity, but its structure. It revealed how ordinary processes, when fragmented, can allow extraordinary harm to remain undetected for extended periods. In conversations among investigators today, the case is often referenced indirectly, not always by name, but by pattern. It becomes shorthand for a set of conditions: marginalized victims, inconsistent reporting, delayed linkage between cases, and environments where absence does not immediately trigger urgency. It is used as a reference point for what happens when these conditions align over time without interruption. But within that professional framing, there is always an underlying awareness that no analytical model can fully capture what it meant in human terms. For the families, time did not transform the core reality of loss. It only changed how that loss was carried. Some described it as learning to live alongside absence rather than through it. Others described it as a permanent shift in how they experience memory, where the past no longer felt fully separate from the present. There were moments, often unexpected, where something small would trigger a return of detail. A street name, a photograph, a mention in passing of a place that had once been part of an everyday routine. These moments did not reopen the case, but they reopened emotional space that had never fully closed. In the broader public, however, the case gradually settled into history. It became part of Canada's criminal record, cited in discussions of serial offending and systemic oversight. New cases emerged over time, new investigations captured attention, and the collective focus shifted forward. Yet the structural lessons of this case remained embedded in how certain systems now operate. One of the most lasting impacts has been the increased emphasis on early pattern recognition in missing persons investigations. Analysts now place greater importance on cross-referencing seemingly unrelated reports, especially when they involve individuals from vulnerable populations. The understanding that delay itself can become a form of concealment has influenced how urgency is assessed in early stages of investigation. There is also a more subtle shift that has occurred in public awareness. The idea that disappearance is not always immediately visible has become more widely understood. People are more likely now to recognize that absence is not always treated equally, and that visibility can influence how quickly concern translates into action. Still, even with these changes, there remains an unavoidable limitation. Systems can improve, procedures can evolve, but they cannot retroactively recover what was lost during the period when recognition had not yet occurred. That is where the case ultimately rests, not in unresolved questions of guilt, because those were addressed within the legal framework, but in the irreversible gap between when harm occurred and when it was fully understood. Over time, this gap becomes the defining feature of the case. Not the violence itself, but the delay in its recognition. Not only what happened, but how long it took to see what was happening in a connected way. For those who study it now, the case functions less as a singular story and more as a cautionary structure. It is used to illustrate how systems can be technically functional yet still produce delayed awareness when information remains fragmented across different points of contact. And for those outside of institutional analysis, it remains something simpler and more difficult at the same time. A reminder that absence is not always immediately legible, that people can disappear into spaces that are not physically hidden, but socially unconnected. And that recognition, when it comes too late, cannot restore what time has already taken. In the end, what remains is not a conclusion in the traditional sense. It is an ongoing responsibility carried forward by those who continue to work in prevention, investigation, and advocacy. A responsibility to notice earlier, to connect sooner, and to treat absence not as background noise, but as a signal that requires attention before it becomes irreversible. That is the final weight of the case. Not only what it revealed about one offender, but what it exposed about the conditions that allowed patterns to persist unrecognized for too long. In the final reflection on this case, what lingers most is not the procedural outcome, nor even the catalog of evidence that eventually brought clarity. It is the unsettling realization of how long something can exist in plain sight before it is fully understood as a connected reality. When investigators look back now, they do not see a single moment where everything failed. Instead, they see a long sequence of smaller moments where interpretation lagged behind reality. A missing person report filed and categorized. A body discovered but not immediately linked. A pattern forming, but only visible in fragments scattered across time and jurisdiction. Each piece, on its own, appeared incomplete. Together, they formed something that should have been recognized earlier, but was not. This is what makes the case continue to matter in professional circles. Not because it is an isolated anomaly, but because it reflects a structural vulnerability in how systems process uncertainty. The danger was never just in one individual's actions. It was in the delay between action and recognition, between event and connection, between disappearance and pattern. For the communities most affected, especially those already living on the margins, the impact of that delay was not abstract. It was cumulative. Each missed connection meant more time without answers, more families left in uncertainty, more names circulating in conversations without resolution. The emotional weight of that accumulation cannot be measured in legal terms, but it defines the lived experience of the case more than any verdict ever could. Even after closure in the judicial sense, the social memory of the case continues to function differently depending on proximity. For some, it is history. For others, it is lived memory that never fully transitioned into the past. This uneven distribution of memory is part of what gives the case its lasting complexity. It does not exist uniformly in time. It exists in layers, depending on who is remembering and from what position. Within law enforcement training, the case is often used to emphasize the importance of pattern awareness across fragmented datasets. New protocols in some jurisdictions now encourage earlier cross-referencing of missing persons reports that share demographic, geographic, or behavioral similarities. These changes are not framed as reactions to one case alone, but the influence of cases like this is always present in the background. Yet procedural improvement is only one dimension of the legacy. There is also a deeper psychological lesson that remains difficult to articulate fully. It is the discomfort of realizing that visibility is uneven, and that uneven visibility has consequences that compound over time. In hindsight, many of the signals that now appear obvious were once indistinct. Not because they were hidden, but because they were distributed across systems that were not designed to interpret them collectively. That gap between distribution and interpretation is where the critical delay occurred. For those who worked directly on the investigation, that realization often arrives later, after the case has concluded. It does not take the form of blame, but of recognition. Recognition that knowledge was always partial at each stage, and that completeness only emerged in retrospect. For families, however, retrospect does not change lived time. It only reframes what that time meant. The years of waiting, the cycles of uncertainty, the moments of false hope followed by silence, all remain intact in memory. What changes is the understanding that those experiences were not isolated, but part of a larger pattern that was only later made visible. And so the case settles into a final state that is not resolution, but awareness. Awareness that systems are not only judged by their ability to respond, but by their ability to recognize early signals before they accumulate into irreversible outcomes. Awareness that delay itself can become part of harm. And awareness that once recognition finally arrives, it cannot restore what was lost in the time it took to arrive. This is why the case continues to be referenced long after legal proceedings have ended. Not because it offers closure, but because it offers structure to a difficult truth, that some failures are not sudden, but gradual, not isolated, but distributed, and not always visible until after they have already shaped the outcome. In that sense, the case does not conclude with certainty. It concludes with responsibility, a responsibility carried forward by those who study it, teach it, and remember it, to ensure that the conditions which allowed it to unfold slowly become harder to repeat. That is the final lesson it leaves behind.